Basically, this panel is going to be your panel. I'm going to let each of these folks introduce themselves, but you have some pretty high-level talent here. And I'm going to let you ask them questions. I don't care whether it's about guitars or amps, or I will mention Mitch Colby has been with Cord, Marshall, Vox, and he has his own amps, Colby amps. But when it comes to history and historical things, if you have a question about a Marshall or a Vox or something, he's probably got the answer. And then we also have down here a speaker guy, and that knows probably more about speakers than most people around, and some other pretty amazing talent. So I'm going to just start with Pat here and let each of these folks introduce themselves. Just tell everybody, feel free to plug your company. Clothing's optional. You're allowed to drink alcohol on the counter. And you can talk about things that are totally unrelated. You can make this not about you. Basically, they're questions. So we start with Pat and
Pat Quilter, now of Quilter Labs. I was going to take over the world in 1968 with loud guitar amps, and of course, being the latest thing, we were building them in solid state. And gave it a pretty good run, but we were too young to really get going. So the two partners and I formed QSC Audio, which became a major supplier of PA and Pro Audio gear. I think they're using a couple of our speakers for the PA next door. Anyway, 40-something years later, I'm back in the guitar amp business, trying to finish the job I never quite wrapped up back in the day. So we're making high-performance, modern, lightweight amps with a rich, warm, vintage sound that I learned from observing how some pretty classic tube amps behave.
That big boomy voice. How's that? Oh, that's better. So, as Miles said, I worked for the U.S. distributor for Cord and Marshall and Vox for many, many years, and so I have a historical perspective on that. I started in '78. I guess that was after the prime time of the stuff that I love, which was '60s. And but anyway, I worked there until 2010, then I did some things for a couple of years and then started my own amp company. I'm making Colby amps and also Park amplifiers, which are reissues of the old early Marshalls. So that's what I'm doing. And if you have any questions for me, that would be just great.
I'm James Demeter, and I founded Demeter Amps 35 years ago when I realized I was not going to make it as a rock star anymore. And thank God I had a little electronic engineering to fall back on. I think my first product actually was a thing called the Tube Direct Box, because my cousin worked with Jensen Transformers and it seemed like a natural. And so we did that, and then I started working at Carruthers Guitar Repair, and Leland Sklar expressed an interest in getting a tube preamp, so I eventually designed my first bass preamp, which I guess we've been making now for 35 years. And from that, I went on to making my first pedal, and Quilter needed a tremolo pedal, and back in 1982, they didn't have tremolo pedals anymore. So the tremolator came out then, so that was my first pedal. And as time went on, I eventually started to make guitar amps, the TGA3, and I started to make microphone preamps, which was the biggest money maker I ever ran across, the two mic preamps. I sold about 3,500 of those, along with another 3,000 tube compressor units. And then Pro Audio got kind of weird when when my base market, small studios, disappeared because of Pro Tools. And everyone could do it in their house. And then I still stay in amplifiers. I make more pedals now. In fact, my latest little thing is an amplifier that's all fit on a pedal board, and it is an all-complete tube front end, a special way of mounting, setting the signal to the Class D amplifier, and setting that with the story with this right here. So anyway, any questions about anything that goes over 35 years now? I have an answer. You're on your own.
1, 2, hey. Good morning. Hey, I'm George, and I've had the lucky distinction of working with several people on this panel up here, and good friends with many of these guys, and just to be acquainted with some of the other ones. Just a guy who played music for a living for a long time, and then had to get out of that lifestyle. Had some children, grew up a little bit, just enough. Big old amps. I have some cool old amps, and I'm like, what makes them sound the way they do? And kind of started down that path, and now it's a sickness. So just still exploring why something can be bright but not harsh, and that kind of sums up most of it, really. That's about it. Just really dig old amps and like talking shop and geeking out, and big history buff, and most importantly, a good dad. A couple of great kids, and that's my main thing in life. But on the side, I do some amp stuff.
My name is Rick Skillman. I'm with Celestian. I look after the U.S. 10 years now, I think. I was the first American they trusted to bring on board, and they don't know how to get rid of me. So, has everybody seen the most interesting man in the world commercials? You know, you've seen that advert campaign. That's really Miles. Totally patterned after him. I've said that for years, yeah. You can get into it, he'll tell you a story that blows your mind, and stuff that movies are made of. Every time.
Well, basically at my age, you pretty much, the reason I take pictures of food and post them,
Right.
is that meal might be my lunch. Actually, to interject something here, there was a girl that I was with who said, "How would your last ex-wife describe you?" And I said, "A complex network of flaws." She ended up posting it on Twitter that I took a screen snapshot on and then posted it on Facebook. But basically, I've been married 3 times, been shot twice, been in 2 airplane crashes and parachute accidents. So,
I'm telling you the truth.
Stories.
Right. That was last week. So, anyways, yeah. Actually, you said that, and the first time I got to work with Ed Van Halen, and he said, "I'm very simple in a complicated way." So he took the simplest of things and plays guitar like he does, and then I picked up his guitar and I sounded nothing like him, so I sell speakers. But yeah, I still gig. I just moved to Austin, Texas, gigging out there. And it's always been my escape. It's where I leave the iPhone in the car and don't have to answer emails from around the world. But yeah, so I look after the U.S., all the OEMs, a lot of the boutiques, and then the artists. So we have about 150 from Jimi Hendrix. We're the only company that was authorized to use his likeness. Because we actually called his family and talked to him 12, 15 years ago, just before I started. Yeah. Well, my boss did. You know Irene? So, yeah, that's about it. So I was just in England 3 days ago, and I still feel like it's upside down on my tongue. But I'll do my best for you if you have any questions regarding speakers.
I thought that was a Scotch.
Scotch got me right side up, and then horizontal.
Hi, I'm Dave Friedman. I have a company, Friedman Amplification. Many years ago, I moved here from Detroit, Michigan, out here to California when I was 18, and started working in this business, and soon realized that, my dreams of being a guitar player were over. They're harsh reality. started working in the business and started doing guitar rigs and pedalboards and different things for a variety of artists and people. And it kind of snowballed over the years. I was always into amps, even from the time I was 15 years old, you know. What makes this work? And I just experimented and learned and picked it up and still learning. Everyone is. Anyone up here is still learning, probably. That's about it. I'm not working here.
I'll interject something. So Dave got to restore Eddie Van Halen's #1 classic a few years ago.
That was fun. Yeah, the game over, thanks.
Actually,
He wouldn't say it himself, but I'll say it for him.
Actually, I'd like to add one more thing about Dave. Some people think of Friedman amps and the Metro Friedman stuff and the high gain and ball buster kind of amps, but a lot of people might not realize is he also did all the racks and stuff with Brad Paisley. So that's kind of on the other side of the, you have the hard rock kind of stuff.
He goes both ways.
He goes both ways.
Great, thanks, George.
And now I'm going to open this up and just raise a hand and start with you.
Go ahead, we've been talking to the show for quite a while. I know it's a Marshall one up there, Mitch, and George, Friedman. George, first of all, I'd like to thank you for being a pioneer and open up the kids for the whole country of Marshall.
Thank you.
And Mitch, taking the balls and Marshall and starting the Empire, Marshalls, Friedman. I'd like to thank you for taking the Marshall to an edge. Now my question to you guys is, when you guys going to start the magazine?
I personally wouldn't do anything in print anymore.
Microphone. Use a microphone.
Yeah, I personally wouldn't do any kind of in-print magazine anymore. They're pointless. It should just be online, and there's a lot of good material online. To run a magazine for, I think, a lot of these folks would be next to impossible because they're busy doing things. I mean, Mitch, you talked about Marshall. I brought people into his room over the last couple of years because his Colby does some of the best Fender-inspired stuff on the planet. I mean, he does the Fender stuff and the Marshall stuff and the Vox stuff. But I mean, as far as magazine, I wouldn't get involved. But then again, at my age, you don't get involved in much more anyway because you're
I'm more than willing to contribute. I don't know where to start with a magazine. Just operating a Facebook page and an online forum. It's kind of out of my scope. But
I think any of us would contribute, though, if someone were willing to start it and run it.
well, we're doing what we're into. We have a unique disposition of doing something that we love. So contributing is just, it's not even a thought. It's just that's just living and breathing. So I wouldn't know how to start a magazine, but we'd all like to disseminate all this information if we like,
Well, I think the closest thing might be the Tone Quest, where they'll take your couple names and really get into detail on the product. Are you thinking about really more detail?
I'm thinking more detail like back in the 50s when we have this, kids and magazines like radio,
that's what people knew how to actually build stuff though.
yeah.
Now people in their home, see, one of the problems that you run into is, well, there's a lot of problems that you run into. People, home hobbyists, used to have a different skill set than a lot of the people today. I mean, ham radio, you used to have to know about vacuum tubes and how to do certain things at a very detailed level. Today, it's more of a plug and play. And I'm sure if you want to build an amp or something, I bet if you go on the App Store right now, I'm sure you could probably find an app from your iPhone that's like how to build a Fender Tweed Deluxe amp or something. I mean, Bruce Demeter puts on classes that most of them are back in the Michigan area, but his classes, basically you build an amp in those that you get to take home. And they're pretty high-end amps, pretty nicely done. But that's all I have to say on that.
It is true that when I was growing up, you could go down to Radio Shack or Lafayette and get little 1 watt, transistorized modules. I made an AM radio out of a couple of parts. Then I turned that into kind of an early boombox with a little cute little tape recorder. It was loud enough to play in the car, and nowadays I think a lot of the kids who are interested in making stuff end up doing either software projects or maker bot type stuff where or write an app or you get some kind of robot type technology and play with that. And so one of my objectives is to try to create a new generation of analog amplification that will carry the art forward and let us kind of preserve the classic tube amps for let them go in it, because tubes will last pretty much forever on the shelf. They don't evaporate, they don't dry out. So the idea is to not have to put hard miles on some of these classic pieces that defined a sound that people are still using today.
Let's go on to somebody else have a question? Go for it.
Picking up on what was said there, what's the future? I mean, it was vacuum tubes and it was solid state, back to vacuum tubes in the digital, back to vacuum tubes. What do you guys see as the future of vacuum tubes?
Well, I'll take that because we're working in Class D, which is the 3rd generation of amplification. Tubes started it all, then linear solid state was in a very loose way replacing individual tubes with individual power transistors, but they operate in much the same way. They operate at lower voltage and higher current, but that's kind of incidental. Class D is a fundamentally different way of processing power, and it can be done with very little loss, so it allows you to package more power in a smaller box. The trick, though, is still to make it sound good, and that's where the art of engineering comes in. For complicated reasons we can go into if anyone's interested, tube amps tend to naturally have a very nice warm sound that created the sound that we're all now regard as premium quality sound, whether it's clean or overdrive. Trying to get that sound with more modern technology is what I'm all about. But I know some of these other guys are taking tubes just to that a little closer to some vision of perfection, and hoping we can still get to some trouble.
What I think is interesting, if you go, what's the future? I think you have to look at the history, and it's a unique thing in the history of the fact that in the 1950s and 60s, all the iconic things happened. So in 1959, 58, you had the Les Paul, the Burst, you had the Strat in the 50s, you had the Telecaster, the Broadcaster, you had the Tweed amp. I mean, everything, all the iconic things happened just sort of, almost just by happenstance. And then we've been chasing them ever since. And then in the mid to late 60s, you had the Marshalls and stuff, and the Stacks, and then in the early 70s, SVTs, which I'm also a big fan of. But all these iconic things, they happened just, they just, almost like nobody planned it that way. They just came and it just defined things.
You also can't digress too much. Some of us, we all grew up with certain tones and sounds that we go, oh my God, I love the guitar solo and the whatever. Well, that was played through whatever, okay? If you digress too far from the model of what we think of as the tones and the characteristics that make us happy, we don't like it.
There's a deep psychological and memory-oriented sort of association with that, an oral sort of memory thing, oral association with. I mean, I make fun of it, but there's some truth to it. I go, there's two kinds of gear: gear that makes me feel like Jimi Hendrix, and gear that doesn't. And there's only about a handful of things that actually do. And if I ever play some piece of gear that makes me feel like a black man, then that's a pretty good piece of gear. But it's about the association. It's about the experience. Like you plug into something, and go, oh man, that sounds like old records. Well, that's the goal for me. I mean, that's what you're shooting for. And so we're still chasing things that just sort of happened and just became iconic. And so the future, to answer the question, is I don't think it really, until we turn the corner and redefine those sort of iconic things, then we're still looking back. But things will, technology evolves and we find new ways to go about it, but it seems like we still are shooting at the same target. So I don't know what the next thing's going to be that really, it redefines things, so to speak.
Well, I think, the electric guitar became an instrument in the 60s. Its capabilities were pretty well explored. There were some classic combinations of guitar and amplifier that produced this kind of iconic sounds that we were just talking about. And, since then, the sound that people want is pretty stable. Nobody's trying to change the sound of a saxophone or a piano these days. It's an instrument. It is what it is. What I find interesting about today's engineering is a lot of those iconic amps were really kind of accidental. They were designed by, guys with, pocket protectors and slide rules who were just trying to make a fairly clean amplifier, and they were kind of surprised when Eric Clapton would routinely slap all the knobs to 10, what's up with that? I didn't want it to do that. And, but certain models proved to have certain performance characteristics. They became iconic, and now we have a crop of engineers who are actively involved in that tone. They're not just designing something in a lab on an oscilloscope, but they probably play an instrument themselves. They certainly associate closely with artists who play and try to incorporate those nuances of performance into the instrument, whatever the technology is that they're using.
When Pat says that there were accidents, does anybody here know why Fender amplifiers became very, very popular and Gibson amplifiers did not?
Fenders were more reliable?
No.
Have to do with the basement?
Nope. Basically what it was is Fender amps were designed to be played with Fender guitars and Gibson amps were designed to be played with Gibson guitars. A humbucker pickup had more output than a single coil. So if you had a Gibson Les Paul, as an example, or an SG, and you plugged it into a Fender amp and cranked the guitar all the way up, you got a certain kind of distortion. Yet, you got distortion sooner or earlier, yet Gibson amps were much lower gain, and if you plugged a Gibson amp into a Gibson, or Gibson guitar into a Gibson amp, you would get kind of what was expected, but a low output Fender guitar into that Fender, or into the Gibson amp. It was anemic, it sounded kind of
And there again, that's a perfect example. Neither Leo Fender or the guys who designed Gibson really wanted the amp to distort. That was a defect. And the idea that it would be pushed well into overdrive was something the musicians invented. And, Marshall and the other companies recognized it in time and began to build product oriented towards that. But it was really the musicians playing with their toys that developed that whole realm of the sound of the electric guitar. And the electric guitar, I would say at least half of its repertoire, its tonal repertoire, has to do with overdrive, sustain, how it feeds back, how it holds power chords, and the amp's a big part of that too.
I think people today, so the target is those iconic sounds, but people are chasing or building amps to do what I call post-production tone. So Eddie's amp didn't sound, Ed's amp probably didn't sound like that in the studio. Jimi Hendrix's amp probably would have taken the fillings out of your head, but, old tube consoles, old recording techniques, time, everything else that goes into it. So now you can get an amp that you can get all your classic, both of these guys, and all the way down the line, actually, you can get that Brown sound, and it sounds just like it did on the record. But if you use that amp to record it back then, you'd have a different target. And somebody asked me about, my stack to sound really warm like Jimi Hendrix's, and I said, well, he didn't use speakers from the 40s. The speakers are brand new. But everything else in the equation is, much different these days, so.
What's a great thing is to go off on a tangent just a little bit. What's a great thing is everyone who comes into my shop, my little place, it's mandatory. If you come in, you have to play a vintage amplifier, and it's always the same thing. Without fail, invariably, you go, all right, here's a guitar, and here's my '59 Bassman, and so they plug in and they go. And then there's always a pause, and they go, and you see it, literally, a light wind, oh, okay, I get it. And then, all right, here's a '68 Super Lead stack. Here's a vintage Marshall stack. And everybody should experience this at least once. And you go, and it scares you a little bit at first. So look, there you go.
Get your feelings out.
You're like, whoa, shit. And then and you see it, and you go, I get it now. I know, now I understand why those records sound the way they do. And and then you switch pickups or something, and you change, you're like, oh, there's that tone. And then you turn on the '59 Bassman, I set up the Echoplex and put a little slap back, and they go, oh, dude, that's it right there. And you're like, yeah.
Often many things have been lost over the years. And people don't really know. They hear it on record, but they've never experienced it.
Well, so you hear it and you go, oh, that must be this, or oh, this sounds like that. But then when you go right to the
Sometimes it
source,
scares the shit out of me.
yeah, well, it makes a man out of you too.
No, George, it's kind of, it's the same thing with cars. You can go out and buy the latest, Lexus LS 350 or Mercedes, whatever, AMG, that's 450 horsepower. Of course, it's at 450 horsepower, very high RPM, and yeah, it's a thrilling car to drive, and it's very refined and elegant and does all the neat stuff. But then if you get a 68 or 67 427 Corvette, it might not have the same top end, but it has torque, and torque is what throws you into the back of the seat, and that makes you smile.
And it's a raw machine. There's no safety guard. You stomp on it, and the gas flows through like turning on a faucet, and off you go. If you can't control it, you're going to be in trouble. And that's that's the thrill of playing like a real honest to God big stack. You makes your pants legs flat.
Thank God this guy got a gig.
I'll open the discussion on the future of tubes, because I look at tubes every day and have been on top of the manufacturers since 2002 or so. Basically, they're getting progressively worse. The consistency is worse. The quality of the parts, tubes are still made by hand. And so as you pay people a competitive wage, they don't really care about the workmanship or the value or the quality. And then you have people out there that are the big dogs, like Mike Matthews, Softtech, Reflector. And what they do is when a tube starts declining a little bit in interest in the marketplace, they'll put gold pins on it, which, when I worked at Crew Tubes, Aspen Pittman came to me one time, he said, Miles, what do you think of if we start putting gold pins on all the tubes? We can charge way more money, and it costs virtually nothing to do that. I mean, it's, the cost is nothing. So basically what new sensors does is they'll come out with the, it was originally called the 12AX7EH 10 years ago. Then it became 12AX7 Gold Pin EH, and then it was the Tungsol reissue, and then it was the Tungsol Gold Pin reissue, and their 12AX7 LP or LPS is now the Mullard reissue, as they buy these names. What's that?
They also just did a short plate version of that, the CV4004.
Yeah, you know, they just basically come out and copy certain things, but there are people that are trying to do things right, and it's basically the consumer that, when you look at Northern Electric, that just came out, the 12AX7, it's supposedly Canadian, it's made in China also. But as time goes on, you know, consumers will basically shun certain companies and start giving their business, like JJ. They can be inconsistent on a number of things, but they don't try to copy anybody else, and I think they do make a pretty decent product for the money, and more people are using those. If you're an individual, you can still try to go NOS in your own amps. If you're a or if you're an amp manufacturer, I feel really sorry for you guys, because I don't know how you do it.
No kidding.
We said, last year on the panel, we said when I was manufacturing amps for Dave in my shop, we would order 100 Chinese preamp tubes and be lucky to get 10 that would work in the first position, the most critical sort of preamp
At
position.
GT, we used to have
For microphonics, yes.
50% rejection rate on tubes, except from EI, where it was 90%. But EIs were real high gain, and they would tend to show problems.
Sounded good though.
I don't know how you guys do it.
Yeah, I mean, back in the 60s, when color TV still used tubes, you know, there was this huge demand, and they had to really work. You know, we had our first RCA color TV, lasted for 13 years. My father fell asleep in front of it every night. The thing would play Snow all night long, and he would wake up in the morning and turn it off. You know, so that, you know, that set ran for like 100,000 hours. And then all the tubes gradually sort of faded out evenly, and the color kind of went pale, and, you know, never really stopped working. It just sort of petered out. I mean, that's when they had quality control, and they were making tubes. You know, the RCA made their own tubes because they needed their sets to work.
You know, and the military used tubes back then too. If you look at old B-52 radios, they have metal 6L6s, metal can 6L6s in the aircraft radios. I find it funny now when you look at a 5751, which is basically a slightly lower gain 12AX7 replacement. That was a specified military tube that the two sides were supposed to be balanced, and it also could withstand 600 Gs. I don't know how they measured that. Of course, you know, because you break the glass. I guess maybe a shaker table or something. Yeah, but you know, today I see people advertising 5751s that are nothing more than reject 12AX7s and charging more money for them.
Well, when I started in 1978, my boss told me, Mitch, tubes aren't going to be around much longer. And I think we're really lucky that we even have tubes being manufactured today, and it's only because of the guitar business that they even are. High-end stereo, but I don't even think it's as big as guitar amps. And so I think the future is bleak, personally. Buy some new old stock tubes, buy tubes now for the rest of your life, and you'll be okay.
When I started too in 1980, you couldn't get a good tube anymore. I'm kind of grateful the new sensor started up. At least you could get something, because GE closed their plant, and we're lucky we can get anything, I think, personally.
And we changed our circuits to accommodate the sort of inadequacies or the quirks of new tubes. You can't heat them the same way anymore, and you have to keep them within much more rigid rigid sort of specs.
My tube direct box, some tubes, because of the horizontal mount, the cathode actually shorted the heater. Right, and that was it. It was over with.
Right.
So I couldn't use those tubes.
You know, and
We
then,
bombed that factory anyway. That was
The
the tongues ran the factory. There we go.
and here's a little factor that was just in that really thick Vox book that somebody loaned me. You know, back in the day, guitar amp companies tended to push their tubes pretty hard because they wanted more billable watts. You know, hey, mine's got 50 watts. That's 5 watts more than your 45 watt thing. So they would run them kind of at the top of their spec. But AC voltage has inched up over the years. What we still loosely say 110, but it hasn't been 110 since I don't know when. I mean, it's theoretically 117, but it's often 125. And so a lot of tubes are running a little hotter than they really meant to be, and they're not as good as they used to be. So you would probably do well to, back off, kind of let people realize, really 80 watts is not that much different than 100 watts, but your tubes might last, 5 times longer, and that would really help.
Absolutely.
Are there new factories for tubes now?
No, not really. I
There's a place out in Las Vegas. There's a place out in Las Vegas that was going to try to make a 6L6. And I contacted them, and I really didn't get a lot. Initially, it was very difficult to get in touch with them, so I started posting some things on social media, and they kind of panicked and contacted me. I have some pieces that I wrote, like a blog that I write that gets between 5,000 and 10,000 people a day on it. So if I start bitching about something, a lot of times whoever I'm bitching about will say something. So I contacted these folks. I ended up talking to the son and the woman who were going to do all this stuff. This was, I guess, going about a year ago at this point. Nothing really happened, but the woman said to me, yeah, we're going to make the 6L6 GE. We bought all of the equipment from Groove Tubes. And I said, that's kind of interesting. If you actually go to this page on my website, you'll see photographs of all of your equipment when we were trying to make it work right, and explain to her all the problems that we had, and that I wasn't going to hold my breath, but please keep me informed, and then I haven't heard from them since.
The best thing I ever did was tell you that Jeep dealer out in Narco pissed me off. So he puts it on his blog, and a million people read it. I got a call from them. So thanks for the free oil changes for life.
I think basically when you have maybe 2 Chinese plants that do it, I don't know how many in Russia now.
I have a list.
Couple maybe?
On my website.
And then JJ, Slovakian. That's it. 2 in Russia?
It would be economically viable to put a tube plant here,
Well, there's
tube factory,
Yeah,
specializing
where's
in
it,
audio stuff.
where's the Western Electric? What's the plant that's in sort of the mid-south? There's a company that's doing it with some audiophile tubes here in the U.S. The 300B, yeah.
They're very expensive.
But yeah, I mean, it's. Do you want to pay $100 a tube?
That's what it would cost.
$500 a duet.
$500 for a pair, a match pair tube. It can be done, and there's there's knuckleheads like us that are just into it who will do it if it's possible. But economically viable or sustainable?
There's not enough demand.
Not with the labor rates in this country. That's the biggest problem.
Well, a lot of the formulas and secrets to building tubes have died with the engineers who used to do it. A lot of the secrets have passed just by generations. And so the art, so to speak, of building tubes, it has sort of passed. And then the things that you need to do to build a tube, the EPA just won't allow any longer. So there's a lot of things working against it.
Actually, on the EPA issues, that's something that one of the folks that I worked for used to use as an excuse why he couldn't go high production in California is the EPA and cathode material. It turned out that you could make cathode material all day and there weren't any EPA issues.
Really?
Yeah, the stuff that evaporated that was the binder was kind of almost like an ether kind of a thing, and there were no issues there. That the EPA had no problems with that, and spraying a guitar body with nitrocellulose is a lot more of an issue to try to get a permit for than a tube. So there are no environmental issues, it's just economics and the expertise. I mean, the guy that I was working with at GT, John Mark, he was in a wheelchair on oxygen. I mean, he was even older than I am. And like, you know, it's like his last job was he shut down the Sylvania STR 387 production line.
No kidding.
So, I mean, this guy was pretty ancient. So finding people to try to make this stuff work.
It's a lost art.
Yeah, it really is. Now you have people in China and Russia, and in China you have Shiguang, which is the big plant, the biggest plant. Then you have some smaller ones that like valve art, but they're not. There is no valve art. There's Sino, and what Sino is, S-I-N-O, is all these little teeny plants are under their umbrella. It's like a co-op of tube folks, but. The Chinese might pull it off because, well, I don't know.
I think it's about the best you got.
Yeah, it pretty much is, and if you look at, it's funny, there's some people that seek NOS Chinese 12AX7s, you know.
The new ones are just fine.
Like from the 80s, you know.
Yeah. They're a little different. But you told me, Miles, that the Chinese were about the most consistent available right now.
Well, if you go back and I publish all the tests that I run, and I publish them on a blog and publish them on, you know, all kinds of various places, my website and places. And the Chinese 12AX7s are the most consistent at this point, but that changes. For example, if I look at JJ803S, this batch will be completely different than the next batch. Every 60 to 90 days, all bets are off and the bar is reset.
Don't even be started on that.
Yeah, so.
And what about power tubes?
Power tubes, they don't handle high voltages anymore. They don't, in fact, the GE6CA7, we got to the point when we had that in production that I could make 9 out of 10 fail at 250 plate volts just by letting it kind of idle along, you know. And I went to Aspen and said, you know, we have a problem here, you know. I mean, and what it was, the grid tube, the 6CA7 grids was used rather than shadow grid, and the Chinese built it like that. So it was a manufacturing defect. But yeah, power tubes are even tougher. The JJ power tubes seem to be the most reliable. Unfortunately, to my ear, on their 6L6s, they sound kind of harsh and aggressive, but that's a personal thing. I mean, if you have a PV5150 or an SLO100 or an aggressive kind of an amp, they might be just a ticker or a Mesa Boogie, you know, rectifier. But yeah, power tubes are even harder than preamp. Well, I don't know, at this point, preamp tubes, I don't know how you guys do it because they're microphonic and they rattle and I don't have
the
the
ones that want to talk about that.
If there's not hum and microphonics, then the gain is really low. And once again, you just end up compensating circuit-wise and design-wise for the failings and the quirks of the tubes you have to work with. And what's the alternative? I mean, we can't buy all NOS tubes. You just have to take it for what it is and design around it. And geez, you put an old Mullard in an old Marshall and you go, yeah, that sounds right. And then you try to build a copy of that, and you inspect everything, and you measure every part, and you do everything, you're like, okay, this is A to B, spot on, why does it sound right? And you go, no, the tubes are not the same. I mean, you get the transformers right, that's a big deal. You get the values that have drifted over the years. And, you know, like I spent a lot of time trying to build spot-on replicas of my old Plexi Marshalls, and kind of dedicated myself to that for a decade. And you go, wait, this should be right. Why? What's going on here? And it's, yeah, tubes. They just sounded. You have to abandon that replica idea. At least I had to personally. And you have to go, no, I'm going to take that as a starting point and build something that sounds right based on the components that I have access to now.
Bottom line is like a 12AX7 in the past had a gain of 100. You're lucky today if that has a gain of about 80.
Wow, that's
Really lucky, yeah.
That's low.
Really, yeah. So, I mean, and these are all the pieces of data that I publish. I mean, the 12AX7M Mullard reissue, the first ones that came out that GT was doing, were really spectacular. And then the next run got worse and worse and worse and worse.
Those sounded great
And-
until they started going click, click.
Yeah, but I went to Shiguang, who made those. I used to meet with them once a month with Sean Gow. We'd sit in my office and we'd talk. And all of a sudden the gain went from, you know, like 95 or 100 down to where a 12AY7 or even lower would be. And I said, look, I know something about tubes, but I'm not a genius on tubes. There's something called plate resistance. And plate resistance is supposed to be 62.5K at 250 plate volts with a 2-volt bias, and, you know, kind of went down all the little data with them. And I said, your plate resistance is like down at like 38K, not 62.5. So the tube has no gain, and I don't know what components make plate resistance change. It's not just measuring like a resistor. And I said, but you guys are tube makers, so, you know, whatever you did here, put it back to where it was supposed to be, and we'll be back in, we'll be happy again. And they never could figure it out, because I think they had a bunch of like really young kids who were like 40 and 50, like working for them.
Volts, maybe a KT88 or something. Yeah, right. But all of them will survive indefinitely at 400 volts. It's application specific. If you want to apply context to that and say what tube will survive in a high watt, well, now we can narrow it down. But it's just to throw it out there, like what's a reliable EL34? That's not enough information. You have to be more specific, because there's good ones and bad ones, but they all apply to different scenarios.
Well, there's not many choices either.
Yeah, it's very limited.
You have JJ, basically for EL34s. You have a Chinese E34 STR.
Tungsol.
You have Tungsol, pretty expensive for production amps. You know, and you have various different Sotec branded tubes, be it EH or, oh God, the list is very long with them. Most of those, not so good.
So is there anything as a player that I can do to make my tubes last longer, or keep from ruining them? I mean,
Operate your amp at the correct voltage.
Yeah, what George said, use a variac or an auto form to bring it down to 110 and going into it, if you're using a vintage amp.
Make sure your speakers are the right impedance. Tubes will fry quicker if you're running a high impedance, which not everybody really understands.
Absolutely. If your amplifier has a master volume control, the amount of current in the output section, if you turn the master from 100% to about 70%, goes down exponentially. So a master volume amplifier, most of the time is idling, believe it or not. So if you have an old non-master amplifier, then you're just running things kind of balls out all the time. If you have an amplifier with a master volume, or some level of control, you know, where it's cutting the signal down before the power section, those tubes should be indefinite should just last because most of the time they're really not being pushed.
Keep in mind, that's with a grid biased amp, with a cathode biased amp, like an AC30 or something like that. Even with the amp turned all the way down, if it's not in standby, if it's ready to play, that amp is running at over 100%. It's running flat out. So it doesn't matter where your volume control is on a cathode biased amp. It's gonna eat up tubes much faster.
Well, but there are, when you reach clipping on a tube, some of the current deviates to the screen grid, and that's why they have those screen grid resistors to limit, because they'll turn orange hot and fall apart if you don't limit the current somewhat. Now that's something inside the amp, you can't really change it, but you know, if you have to have the amp repaired anyway, it might be an interesting thing to just tell the tech, you know, raise that value 50% and use a 5 watt instead of a 3 watt or whatever, you know, just beef it up a little bit. And it will, as someone mentioned, would, you know, lets the tube clip with a little less strain on the internal parts.
I have a question away from tubes. Speakers.
Yeah, speakers.
I've got some old speakers. I'm thinking about building some cabinets for an old EV 112S and some JBL things for my clean sound. As speakers age, does the paper in the cone actually get old and brittle? And should I mess with old speakers or should I get some new speakers?
Yeah, buy lots of new ones. No,
Make sure there's the lesson.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, so we've done actually a lot of research.
You guys have been working on cones a lot lately, right?
Yeah, we have one research engineer, and that's what he's doing. And literally, I was just in England a couple days ago, and yeah, they're with a paper consultant who, I mean, they're going pretty deep. And we actually own the Pulsonic name. We have a lot of the original formulas and stuff. And I mean, that's just part of the passion is, you know, not giving up and moving towards the future, but capturing some of those sounds of the past. Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're after. Your speakers will have changed to a degree. It could demagnetize a little bit. Or depends on the life the paper, you know, the cones have lived, you know. A certain amount of smoke and beer spilled onto it has created some iconic sounds, but humidity is probably the biggest factor.
The surround.
The surround changes in the spider, so it's...
If it's a foam surround, ozone after 10 years, it goes away.
Yeah, it'll disintegrate.
These speakers probably don't have that problem if they're MI speakers, but it's amazing how well they do last. I have a, you know, 20s and 30s vintage radios that the speakers still work perfectly well. My advice would be, you know, go ahead and put your vintage products into use. They may or may not, you know, last forever because everything has a lifetime. But what else are you going to do? Run them until something goes out, and then hopefully you can get them reconed nicely with fresh new soft parts, and away you go.
Yeah, the speaker life is you know, there's old speakers still kicking out there today, and have lived a crazy life, and we haven't seen the end of a speaker's life in like a natural, you know, slow death occurrence. We've only blown them up, poked a hole with them in a screwdriver. We just haven't seen. There's a lot of variables, but I tell people all the time, you know, and I was a touring guy for a long time, and I play a gig in Arizona, and it would sound bright and harsh and something. Then I go somewhere where it's more humid. You load that cone up with moisture, and all of a sudden it's muddier, it's thicker sounding, it's darker, and then you know, I get that question a couple times a week. It's like it's a rabbit hole. You start, what's the current coming out of the wall? What's your, you know, that's all these other factors come into why did my amp change? But your old speaker should be fine.
I mean, they wear out around the edge, and there's nothing you can really do to head that off other than, you know, hopefully your cabinets will, are they sealed cabinets or open back? Okay, I mean, the open back cabinet lets the speaker move more, which will wear out the suspension quicker. But of course, it has a nice sound of its own, so that's an artistic choice. But there's nothing that I know of that you can really do to treat or, preserve the speaker. You just have to, play it and get whatever life it has left in it, and then hopefully, like I said, they've still got a good recone kit for it when the suspension does wear out.
It's worth, so if there's a vintage amplifier that you enjoy, or some speakers, or anything that you enjoy, the ideology is play it. It may fail at some point. It has to obey the laws of physics, but if you just store it, there's nothing good happening there.
Certain things, if you store them, like if you have an amplifier that's an old prize, whatever, and you're never going to play it again and save it forever, what happens is the caps dry out and you end up causing actually more damage to it.
I was gonna say it's probably.
If you have amps in storage, pull them out, 2 or 3 times a year, turn them on, for a minute or two. You don't even have to play through them. Just charge up those caps again and keep from getting drying out. But yeah, you gotta, live life. Live life like you're a shark. If you stop moving, you die. Okay, so use your amps.
For Miles Road.
Yeah, eat stuff that'll kill you.
Post it on Facebook.
Yeah, it's
I'll be more lighthearted about it, but I would just say that the most dangerous place for those speakers might be in a box in your garage on a shelf when you knock them over and they fall on the ground and something breaks. But in the box, they're going to live a happy life until they die.
If a vintage speaker is recalled done well, does it go back to its glory, or is recalling it really, like when I see a speaker that I want that's been recalled?
It's a heart transplant. It has to sound different by the laws of physics.
No, it's not going to be the same speaker. I tell people that if you have a sentimental attachment to that old speaker from your 412, then pull it in and it died. Pull it out and put it in the box and on the garage shelf because it's done. You can recone it if you think that it has a little more of a marketing edge when you go to sell it, but those are new parts and it's just a metal frame. So.
And there is one peculiar phenomenon that I used to hear about back in the 60s in the Al Nico days, that sometimes pro audio speakers that were fried would not come back all the way because the magnets had been overheated and they would lose some strength. I don't think that's much of a problem with the ceramic speaker. It can be a problem with Neo. I know that Celestion and everybody has done everything they can to provide heat sinking so it doesn't overheat, but it's a little more vulnerable than ceramic. But even if the recone kit is perfect in a technical sense, it isn't broken in yet. So it's going to be like having your guitar refinished, your flat top. It's not going to sound the same for a few years until everything ages back in, and it's just that's the reality of life.
And even with that, some materials have changed. So when Vox came to Celestion, or they bought one off the shelf, I think in like 1953, and that was our accidental intro into the MI business. Adhesives were different. They came from the little village down the road in England, and then that guy died. We needed different adhesives, or the same thing, try to replicate it. So things will always sound a bit different as time moves on. And just like the amp manufacturers up here, the tube experts, or me being a speaker guy, we're still trying to get back to that iconic sound. We're chasing yesterday.
We haven't talked about transformers either.
Yeah, I'm going to start wrapping this up because these guys have to get back to their rooms. We'll do one more question, and then afterwards we'll just wrap this up. You can find these guys in their respective rooms, which, as we're wrapping up, tell them the official name of your room, and you can continue on your conversation on more of a one-on-one basis with all of these guys. So
My question is, starting with Miles, and then the rest of you can follow, just very quickly or briefly. If you explain, should there be a consensus or a level playing field as far as sensitivity spec rating on output transformers? Because some things regarding speakers are very uniform, they're easy to measure, but output transformers are just either they work or they don't, and that's how they're kind of sold. Does this seem unfair?
Well, actually, output transformers are all very, very, very different. There's hand wound, there's machine wound, there's M6 steel that doesn't have silicone in it, or as much, that's much more expensive to produce. So there's a lot of variability in transformers. If you want to hear for yourself a pretty dramatic difference, find an amp that has here's a great example. Find somebody with a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe. The whole cost to build that amp is $74.21. That's the box, the transformers, everything. Retails for what, $6.49 or something. Put a set of Mercury Magnetics transformers in there that actually cost more than the whole amp when Fender built it, but the amp is going to sound completely different. It's going to be defined and articulate and just, sound like you have a clear shower door and you wiped all the scum off of it and you can see through it again. Transformers are the heart and soul of an amp, and that's the easiest place to cut costs.
But there are specifications, so depending on the tubes you're using and the voltages that they're at, you want to have a certain primary impedance, and if you get a certain impedance on the secondary for the speaker to match the speaker. So there are specs. So if you look at, and some people don't talk about the specs, like if you go to Mercury's site, there's no specs. But if you go to Classic Tone, they actually tell you what the specs are, and you can see the spec sheets, and you can go by each transformer and find out which ones will match whatever situation you're looking for.
Specs are all static, and
well, but it gives you a place to start.
right, it gives you a place to start, but where the magic happens is in the hysteresis and all the things that are happening outside of that place.
We at QSC we dealt with 70-volt transformers for ceiling speakers. And anyone that's going to design a system with such a transformer, they're going to get quite into the, where does saturation set in, how low a frequency can it go, what's the insertion loss, what's the high frequency roll off, and it's it kind of be like can't think of it's like a consumer is going to buy a piston to rebuild their Volkswagen. They're going to say, will it fit? Well, okay, it's the right size, but they're not going to know anything about the alloy and all that. That's what the manufacturer and the car designer worries about. So, there's a real art to transformer design, and it's not all just about the audio. There's output transformers can be exposed to a lot of high voltage. Can break down because they don't appreciate how high the flyback voltage can get when
Absolutely. I think now, so you have a perception of output transformers, and you said the sensitivity of an output transformer. Well, that's not really something that an engineer considers when he is looking at the specifications. And if you use EL34s, you have a certain specification that is the optimal sort of the load impedance that the EL34 can operate in its linear range. And so you have to adhere to the physics in a lot of ways. You want to produce the most output from a given tube in a certain operating condition, and so you select your output transformer accordingly. And in the musical instrument amplifier sort of range of things, we all kind of select the same thing. There's really a handful of manufacturers, and fortunately they're very good. And if you really want to obsess more than that, you can, because I can measure an old one and I go, well, the primary inductance is higher or lower, or this kind of steel in the 60s varied and we send it out and analyze it. We go, oh, it's more like an M15 or an M19. It's annealed, it's not annealed. And so I obsessed over this for a long time, and I built output transformers. Okay, here's an M6, here's an annealed M15, here's a non-annealed M19, and you compare, but ultimately, you can really obsess and split hairs, and just, you can go as far as you want to go on an output transformer. But at the end of the road, you just kind of go, you know what, it obeys the laws of physics. And there are certain quantifiable things about an output transformer that you learn, that you go, okay, put more nickel in and it'll give you a little more of this, or use annealed steel or not annealed steel, more laminations. The more laminations, the better, really, as a general rule. And
Cost trade-off.
Interleaving.
yeah, interleaving, okay, 5
There's
of these,
different things
7
that
interleave.
affect the cost, but do incrementally improve
And
performance.
at the end of the day, you go, you know what? Every single output transformer you can buy right now is 90% of the way there. If you really want to obsess, you can get a few extra percent. I mean, is the difference between a $125 output transformer and a $300 output transformer worth that 3% difference? To many of us, it is. Some people have the design aesthetic that cost is not the object, but the extra 3% is worth exponentially more than whatever it costs to make it happen. Like, I'm more gratified if I do it. But at the end of the day, the laws of physics really dictate what an output transformer does.
I am grateful that I'm not smart enough about transformers to understand any of this. Other than that's the part that can hurt me really bad if I touch the wrong wires, but that's why I go to you guys. Can you fix it?
One of the other trade-offs is a better transformer is usually heavier, and everyone wants lighter weight amps, so that's an easy place to chisel away. And you can get away with some, but it isn't going to be the 95% solution.
I will speak to the speaker thing you mentioned about how our specs are all on. A lot of people say, well, that Almaco Blue, it can take way more than 15 watts. I saw it happen once. And sounded bitching right before it fell apart too. But so different speaker companies use different rating systems, if you will. So Celestion has always gone by AES, so Audio Engineering Society. It is arguably a conservative rating, but there's also a very specific test and certain criteria. Some of my friendly competitors will use program power, which essentially, in layman's terms, you can say that's double AES spec. And then there's peak power, I guess it would be. They say it's 5,000 watts. But yeah. So we just try to give a platform that makes sense from an engineering standpoint, that everybody can say, okay, this is what it can do.
At this point, we really have to wrap this up.
I'm done. Room 1011. Any questions?
Pat Quilter, Quilter Labs, 3001. Just get off the elevator, you'll see our tiki out front.
Mitch, Colby and Park Amps, 1016, right down the hall.
James Demeter, Demeter Amps, 1015 right across from him. I am Alexander Dumble.
25 years ago, I want my $5,000 back.
He's a friend of mine.
No, that's contractually prohibited. I'm George. Metropoulos Amps, I'm 1018.
Rick Skillman, Celestion, 1011.
Dave Friedman, 1019, Friedman Amps. Across from George,
I heard you.
the loud end.